Well, thank you all so much. Can you hear me okay in the back? Yeah? All right, perfect. We're off to a good start. If I can get this thing on, I think oh, 2 for 2. Thank you all so much. This is an incredible turnout. I was joking to a friend. She asked, how many people do you think are going to show up tonight? I said, person. How many? One person. But no, look at this. This is incredible. So thank you all again. So many thank yous. Ann, of course, and Tom, Hope, Nancy. I heard some names. Nolan, who knows more about Kennedy than I do. We had a great chat before. Denny and Cindy and Dan, of course, for the introduction. I'm just so impressed with the work you all are doing here. And I'm inspired to try to bring a little of this back to Eau Claire. So thank you for all you're doing to kind of continue to educate you and your community and the people around you. That's a huge win. And then give out scholarships on top of that. So this is just a very, I knew I came to the right place tonight. I'm really grateful to be here. So thank you so much. And thanks, of course, to the Winchester Academy and the library for just kind of taking a night to focus on local history or state history. I'm a big believer that in the end, all of American history is local history. It's always what's taken place in our own backyards. So tonight you'll see some photos kind of rotating through. Some of them are directly related to what I'll be sharing. Others are just kind of for your enjoyment. Some are kind of never before seen. A buddy of mine, or I ran into a guy at a different reading who took me aside and said, you know, my dad was a photographer in Eau Claire back in the, in the 60s. I think we have some old footage in the attic somewhere. And sure enough, he had some incredible shots. So some kind of rare photos for you as well. So over the past few months, as I've read elsewhere, the moment I mention JFK, someone inevitably says, I've got a story for you. And I think that really reflects how much ground this guy really covered and how he personalized campaigning to a degree that few really had in that era. The problem, though, is that far fewer people ever say anything about his most dogged supporters right here in Wisconsin. And they deserve a little airtime, too. You see, at its heart, this book is about them. It's a team of Wisconsinites who banded together to support Kennedy's 1960 Wisconsin primary, during a time when Wisconsinites' reception for Kennedy was as chilly as our weather. In the 1960 primary, Kennedy was attempting to do what no winning presidential candidate had done before. Rather than rely on the party's convention, he leveraged the power of a series of state primaries to clinch his party's nomination. And the beginning of that journey took him right here, directly into Wisconsin, the first contested primary race that pitted him against the Minnesota senator from next door. You know him, Hubert Horatio Humphrey, who was so beloved around these parts that Wisconsinites affectionately called him Wisconsin's third senator. The stakes were high. Kennedy's father, Joe Kennedy Sr., called the Wisconsin primary, I quote, the crisis of the campaign. And the candidate concurred. Kennedy told supporters, and this was a shock to me, he said, if I am beaten in Wisconsin, I am out. So I always just like to take a moment to let that one sink in. Had Kennedy lost the Wisconsin primary, we may never have had a President Kennedy. So much depended on the Badger State. And in one of the few times in his privileged life, JFK appeared to be at a momentary disadvantage. Here was this silver-spooned East Coast Catholic who hadn't even been to Wisconsin prior to the mid-1950s, facing off against the folksy, farmer-loving Hubert Humphrey, who dedicated his entire political life to this region. Spoiler alert. Thanks to the doggedness and creativity of a handful of Wisconsinites, Kennedy squeaked out a victory, winning 56.5% of the popular vote in the primary and 6 of 10 districts on primary day, April 5th, 1960. It wasn't enough to knock Hubert Humphrey out of the race entirely, but it was enough for both candidates to continue on to West Virginia, where Kennedy's victory landed the knockout blow that prompted Humphrey to exit the primary. Now, Wisconsinites did not go easy on Kennedy, but by toughening him up in the primary season, we prepared him for the trials still ahead. In fact, it was here in Wisconsin where Kennedy found his footing for the presidency. Quote, I suppose that there's no training ground for the presidency, Kennedy remarked during a visit to Milwaukee in 1962, but I don't think it's a bad idea for a president to have stood outside of Oscar Mayer's meat factory in Madison, Wisconsin at 5:30 in the morning with the temperature 10 above, which he absolutely did. Now, some meat factory workers were happy to meet him, others less so. Regardless, Kennedy greeted them all with enthusiasm until his hand bled. For Kennedy, a little blood was a small price to pay to prove himself to the state's primary voters. He needed them to know that despite his family's privilege, he too could put in a hard day's work, or several months' worth of hard days' work on the campaign trail, whatever it took to win over Wisconsin's electorate. And he took the fight right down the road from my home in Eau Claire, likely on Barstow Street in January 1960, when an older woman took Kennedy's hand in her own and said, my son, it's not your time." To which a determined Kennedy said, "Mother, it is my time." And then he went all in on Wisconsin. This was the moment that inspired me to write the book. The fact that this interaction had occurred just down the road from where I lived, and no one in town ever knew it. That this older woman on Barstow Street pushed Kennedy forward as if almost daring him to do it. Would he have gone all in had it not been for her? While Wisconsinites made the biggest impact on their home turf, we can't overlook the better-known out-of-towners, too. A parade of Kennedy family members who encamped in Wisconsin throughout that bone-chilling 1960 winter, and who would stop at nothing to get Jack elected. Like Ted Kennedy, Jack's 28-year-old brother who worked most of the West, but Wisconsin too. A week before the primary, he and his brother shook the tire plant workers' hands in Eau Claire until their hands bled. You'll see a photo of that. And Bobby Kennedy, Jack's 34-year-old brother and campaign manager, who in the winter of 1960 disembarked from a snow-stuck train and hoofed it for several miles through the snow all the way to an event right in another nearby Wisconsin town. And who could forget Jackie Kennedy, the iconic future First Lady known for her fashion and trend-setting, though while in Wisconsin took a when-in-Rome approach and posed with prized hams and led sing-alongs at American Legion halls, and in one truly unforgettable moment, commandeered a supermarket loudspeaker to explain to shoppers in Kenosha why they ought to vote for her husband. Individually, none of these people would have been able to push Kennedy past the finish line to win the pivotal 1960 Wisconsin primary, but collectively, they became unstoppable. I like to think of them as their own Ocean's 11 political team. Everyone had a specialty, and everyone lent it to the cause. These were people who asked not what their country could do for them, but what they could do for their country. And they found their answer long before any such words ever left President Kennedy's lips. Now, since the book was released a little over a year ago now, I've had some incredible interactions, including meeting Paul Lucey, the son of Governor Pat Lucey, who's featured in this book. Paul just happened to show up unannounced to my first reading in Milwaukee and shared some incredible stories, including one incredibly hilarious one about Kennedy's visit to Mexico. Someone please remind me to share that with you at the end of the presentation. It's a good way to go out, I promise you. But a few months back, I received a different note, an email from a 91-year-old man named Mel Catone, who claims to be the last surviving campaign worker from Kennedy's West Virginia primary team. And he told me about how when Kennedy won the primary in West Virginia, he was sent to Michigan to set up Kennedy's Labor Day events in the months leading up to the general election. How he had arrived in Michigan, 25 years old, having never left West Virginia, having never left his town, had never been in a restaurant or taken a bus, suddenly finds himself in the great state of Michigan and found a way to get 50,000 Michiganders, the biggest Kennedy crowd Kennedy had ever had, on the shores of Lake Michigan, an event which likely played a pivotal role in rallying the necessary voters to help Kennedy eke out the pivotal general election win there months later. Amazing, right? A guy who'd never left town got 50,000 people to turn out. And more recently, I received a letter from a man named Gerald, who reached out to share how his father also had a pretty interesting encounter with Senator Kennedy. According to Gerald, Gerald's father had lied about his age in order to join the military so he could fight in World War II. Gerald, his dad was 14 years old when he signed up. My son is 13 years old. He can't clean his room to save his life. This is shocking to me. But when Gerald's dad finally left the military service, he had a hard time getting his separation pay. He didn't quite know how to work the bureaucratic channels for that. So Senator Kennedy was his senator. He knocked on his door. He went to his office and explained the situation. Senator Kennedy wasn't quite sure the ins and outs of how to get this guy his separation pay, so he offered the constituent a personal loan. Senator offered some guy he just met a personal loan, took out his personal checkbook to see if he could help. Now, Gerald's dad politely declined. "I don't need the money today." He said, "I would just like you to look in on it." And then he added, some days I'd like to continue to serve my country in some way. So Kennedy nodded, and by the time Gerald's dad got back to his office across town, there was a check waiting on his desk, and he had a new job working at the American Red Cross. Amazing, right? What a politician would do for a constituent back in those days. But perhaps my favorite and unexpected interaction so far was a note I received from the granddaughter of a Milwaukee Journal reporter featured in the book named Ira Kappenstein. He's a key figure, a man whose dogged reporting really personalized Kennedy in a way that no other reporter did. Now, Kappenstein died at a terribly young age in his early 30s of cancer, so obviously his granddaughter had never met him. But she read the book, and she wrote me the next day, and she said, this is probably the closest I'll ever get to knowing him, which is the nicest thing anyone's ever said about my work. And it speaks to one of my main objectives of this book, which is to bring to life people on the page whose names you may never have heard, and to honor their work, and to learn from it in a modern context. In the early stages of this book, I came across a quote from Rudyard Kipling, who wrote, "If history were told in the form of stories, it would never be forgotten." And that became kind of the North Star for this book. I had it on that little post-it note right above the computer, and I saw that every day, and that really aligned with what I was trying to do. And that's what I set out to do, in the hopes that we don't forget. So tonight I'll share 3 pretty brief scenes from the book, including an opening scene featuring a former Madison mayor named Ivan Nestingen. Maybe some of you remember his name. But before he was a Madison mayor, and before he served as the Health and Human Services Secretary for the Kennedy administration, he was a key ally within Kennedy's Wisconsin primary campaign. Known within the campaign as The Rock for his steady leadership, he laid the groundwork for Kennedy's primary run in Wisconsin, serving as chairman for the Kennedy for President Club. So this opening scene begins on November 13th, 1959, when Ivan had the somewhat unenviable task of driving then-Senator Kennedy up a hill through a blizzard en route to a major event that scared him about as much as the snow. Ivan Nestingen, the mayor of Madison, gripped his steering wheel tightly as he tried to navigate the thick snow falling over Kenosha's slick streets. This was not how Ivan had imagined the day would go. But Wisconsin winters were as unpredictable as the state's politics. Just when you thought you had a read on things, the wind shifted. Politically speaking, Wisconsin was due for a change. The progressive days of fighting Bob La Follette and his meteoric rise from congressman to governor to United States senator now seemed like ancient history. In recent years, La Follette's populist legacy had been shunted aside, replaced by a conservative takeover of Wisconsin politics. By 1948, Republicans had won the governorship and both houses of the state legislature and dispatched Republican senators and congressmen to Washington. This trend had held true in 1956 as well, when Wisconsin voters overwhelmingly cast their ballots to re-elect President Dwight D. Eisenhower. Something needed to change at both the state and national levels, Ivan knew, but it would take the right man to do it. Thankfully, that man was seated beside him in the car. Massachusetts Senator Jack Kennedy stared forlornly out the window as the snow continued to fall. In good weather, the 45-mile jaunt from Kenosha to Milwaukee took no more than 50 minutes, but on this day, the treacherous road conditions slowed them down considerably. It was the kind of Wisconsin welcome that Kennedy had come to expect, less a red carpet than a white one. Throughout the day, the weather had increasingly jeopardized Kennedy's appearances at the Kenosha Union Club, and even worse, the one that followed, the kickoff keynote address for the Wisconsin Democratic Convention in Milwaukee. At least Kennedy could take comfort in knowing that Vice President Richard M. Nixon, who was also in the state that day, would be just as inconvenienced by the weather. For the past 2 days, Kennedy and Nixon had been engaged in a shadow campaign. Neither man admitted their simultaneous trips to Wisconsin had anything to do with the future presidential run, but it was hard to ignore the campaign-style events that dominated their visits. In a series of dueling events that day, Kennedy and Nixon each tried their best to cast themselves as presidential material, making lofty speeches about the role of the United States on the world stage. However, the story dominating Wisconsin's headlines that November involved a more pressing regional matter: cranberries. Arthur Fleming, Secretary of the U.S. Department of Education, Health and Welfare, had just issued a statement warning that a batch of cranberries from the Pacific Northwest had been contaminated by a disease and a dangerous weed killer believed to cause cancer in rats. Thank you. and alerting the public not to buy cranberries if they couldn't confirm the origin. Fleming's timing could not have been worse, especially for Wisconsin, the nation's leading cranberry producer. With Thanksgiving just weeks away, the $50 million cranberry industry was in peril. At peak buying season, cranberries were being yanked from store shelves and restaurants just before the biggest meal of the year. Cities were destroying shipments of cranberries no matter their origin. Chicago health authorities, for example, seized 20 tons of cranberries from Wisconsin Rapids alone. Suddenly, one of the state's most vital industries appeared headed toward freefall. Both Kennedy and Nixon took full advantage of the opportunity to cater to the state's worried voters. On November 12th, Kennedy and Nixon spoke at separate events in the same county. Kennedy at the Hotel Charles in Marshfield, and Nixon 30 miles down the road in Wisconsin Rapids, the heart of cranberry country. The toastmaster for Kennedy's event happened to be the state's most influential cranberry farmer, Thelio Nash, President Truman's former staffer, who by 1959 had become Wisconsin's lieutenant governor. Thelio had been a Humphrey man since that fateful night in the cranberry bog in 1948 when he'd first heard him give an impassioned speech. Fast forward a little bit here. Meanwhile, in Marshfield, Kennedy enjoyed a cranberry juice in front of a standing room only crowd of 1,500 people. Jerry Bruno, now working for Ivan Nestingen on Wisconsin's Kennedy campaign, had spent weeks ensuring the hall would be at full capacity. Yet in the photograph commemorating Kennedy's event, the crowd isn't even looking at the frame. Instead, Thelio and Jack each place a hand on a glass-gallon jug of cranberry juice, smiling widely as it flew into a paper cup. When a photographer encouraged Kennedy to sling the jug over his shoulder and take a sip, Kennedy drew the line. He'd drink the juice, but he wasn't about to look like some backwoods yokel while doing it. Later that evening, a reporter asked how he was feeling. "Well, Nixon and I have both eaten them, and I feel fine," Kennedy said. "But if we both pass away, I feel I shall have performed a great public service by taking the vice president with me." Neither berries nor blizzards weighed heavily on Kennedy's mind the next day as Ivan steered through the snow. Hubert Humphrey, who was scheduled to close the Wisconsin Democratic Convention the following evening, was Kennedy's real worry. That Humphrey would win Wisconsin seemed to many people a foregone conclusion. From his early years as Minneapolis mayor to his decade in the Senate, the affable, farmer-friendly Humphrey had claimed Wisconsin as a second home. Humphrey was particularly popular in the Protestant-leaning agricultural districts of western Wisconsin, leaving even less room for Kennedy to make inroads. Then, on Kenosha's Washington Street Hill, the tires of Ivan's Chevrolet suddenly struggled to gain traction. Ivan planted his foot on the accelerator, hopeful that the tires might catch. The engine hummed and then roared to no avail. As the tires spun, Kennedy, who was far better disposed for Palm Springs sunshine than Kenosha's snow, opened the door and quickly climbed out of the vehicle. Ivan turned just in time to see the senator heading toward the back of the car. Ivan watched in the rearview mirror as a tan-faced Jack Kennedy heaved his full weight against the bumper. This was no Addison's disease-ravaged Jack, but a man who'd spent his youth running for touchdowns in Hyannisport and who, 16 years earlier, had saved his PT-109 crewmates after surviving a Japanese destroyer attack. As Jack pushed hard against the back of the car, streetlights splashed lights all around him. Not a spotlight, not yet, but close. The slush-filled streets slipped beneath him, but Jack held firm, one foot in front of the other, inching the car upward. A separate car had been traveling behind them, carrying Irish Mafia members Kenny O'Donnell and Dave Powers, two of Kennedy's most loyal allies. Within moments, Kenny and Dave were at Jack's side. Together, the trio managed to ease the car up the snowy hill until at last the tires caught. From his place a few cars back, Milwaukee Journal reporter Ira Kappenstein watched the scene unfold. No image could more fully foretell the primary fight to come. A Kennedy versus Humphrey Royal Rumble, which for the former would prove quite an uphill battle indeed. How, after all, could an elitist East Coast Catholic ever compete with a beloved salt-of-the-earth Midwestern Protestant? The answer, with help from those who believed in him. The political climb would be steep, but Kennedy was all fight, all grit, all vigor. Ivan needed only to glance in the rearview mirror to see it. So I love that scene because truly it says everything. It's the perfect metaphor. Kennedy, Wisconsin, pushing uphill in the snow, that was basically the primary through and through. Sometimes it's easy to forget that there was a time in Wisconsin when JFK was hardly a household name. Famously, there's a store where he was shaking hands in a northern Wisconsin bar. This was on St. Patrick's Day, the first, Catholic president, St. Patrick's Day, Wisconsin. He's shaking all these hands. There's a barfly over here enjoying his beer, and Kennedy goes up to him and he says, "The name's Jack Kennedy. I'm running for president." And the barfly kind of looks up from his drink and goes, "President of what?" Only in Wisconsin. And during some of his visits here, he would only get venues at elementary schools. Other places wouldn't have him, so he liked to joke, "If we can lower the voting age to 9, we are going to sweep the state." So while some were aloof to Kennedy's presence and didn't know his name, others were very familiar with his name. Or at least they were familiar with the Kennedy name, as was the case in this next scene on February 23rd, 1960, when a man named Carroll Yaskow attempted to introduce the future president and fell a little short. 48-year-old Carroll Yaskow smiled as he listened to the laughter that filled the dining room of Madison's Hotel Lorraine. This was the perfect venue for the night's festivities, the Wisconsin chapter of the American Institute of Architects' annual convention. As state architect, Carroll had become adept at seeing the artistry in places others often overlooked. A different kind of artistry was required in pulling off a night like tonight. So far, everything was going as planned. State chapter members happily filled every white linen-covered table, exuding an air of opulence in their suits and ties and dresses as the cocktail hour gave way to dinner. Carroll, who preferred a drafting table to a banquet table, nonetheless had agreed to serve as the evening's MC. Looking around the room, he was pleased to see that everyone was enjoying themselves. Maybe a little too much. But so what if his colleagues indulged a bit? If anything, it would help his jokes land with a bit more zing. Yet the best joke of the night was the one Carroll hadn't prepared for. Carroll was sitting at the front table of the hotel dining room when a fellow architect and chapter committee member approached him. The committee member had learned that Jack Kennedy and his wife Jackie happened to be staying just a few floors up, and would it be okay if perhaps they popped down to say hello to the architects? Carroll thought it was great. Who wouldn't want to say hello to some candidates? Getting to meet a presidential candidate from either party was something he thought the architects in the room might appreciate. The elevator doors opened, and a dapper Jack and a dazzling Jackie began their cinematic descent down the balcony stairs. It was a grand entrance that should have silenced the room. Two famous and breathtakingly beautiful people dressed in their best, walking down the architectural world's equivalent of the red carpet. But the architects at their tables, absorbed in their discussions and drinks, barely took notice, except for Carroll, who beamed as the Kennedys made their way toward the front of the room. Later, Carroll would wonder if the lack of attention the Kennedys received had something to do with the Republican-leaning crowd. For his own part, Carroll welcomed them warmly, grasping Jack and Jackie's hands and thanking them profusely for taking the time. "Would you care to say a word or two to the architects of our state?" Carroll asked. Jack, who hadn't even known who was in the room 2 minutes earlier, happily agreed. He proceeded to give, as Carroll would later describe it, an extemporaneous, spontaneous talk on the responsibility of the architect to society. He called it the Exploding Society, and that made a tremendous impact on those people, and I'm sure he gained some votes. Carroll listened in awe. "The great regret of my life," he later said, "was that someone forgot to turn on the tape recorder." But that wasn't his only regret of the evening, because immediately before Jack's speech, Carroll would commit a blunder so memorable that its legend soon surpassed the speech itself. Reaching for the microphone, Carroll quieted the crowd and began his introduction. "We have with us tonight for the Democratic nomination for president," Carroll said, "a candidate here, and I thought you would like to see one in the flesh." The crowd chuckled. "I introduce you to," Carroll began, "Senator Robert Kennedy." As Carroll turned to pass the mic to Jack Kennedy, the room erupted in uproarious laughter. Confused, Carroll replayed the introduction in his mind before realizing the terrible truth. Had he said Robert Kennedy? It was an innocent mistake, but also mortifying. A good-humored Jack accepted the mic with a grin. "You know, yesterday I was in Eau Claire," Jack began, "and a nice old lady came up to me and said, 'Mr. Kennedy, I'm just so glad that your sons are taking an active part in public life. I think that's wonderful.' So I said, 'Thank you, madam, but I happen to be one of those sons. You're talking about my father.'" The laughter grew. "Before that, I was up in Wausau, where the skiing was pretty good, and some of the young people got around me and said it was just wonderful that I found time to ski up there last weekend, and I had to tell them that was my brother Ted. Louder still. Best of all was over in Sheboygan, Jack continued, and a very nice pair of ladies came up to me and said, "It's just wonderful that busy people like you can still find time to have a large family of children." So I had to tell her that was my brother Robert. By then, even Carol was laughing. He took me off the hook so beautifully, Carol later reflected. If this had been Carol's only encounter with Jack Kennedy, it would have made for a pretty good story. But what happened next made for a better one. A few weeks later, after his embarrassing mishap at the Hotel Lorraine, Carol was lounging in the all-but-empty Madison airport, awaiting his late-night flight home back to Wausau. Suddenly, there was a slight commotion as people gathered to get a glimpse of a plane taxiing toward the gate. Carol looked up. It was Kennedy's plane. No, Carol thought, impossible. It was freezing that night, about 20 degrees below zero. When Kennedy approached in the airport terminal moments later, he was hatless, his hands buried deep in his pockets of his thin blue topcoat, his shoulders raised toward his ears. Kennedy's eyes soon drifted toward Carol on the opposite side of the room. Carol tried making himself invisible, to little avail. Though they'd only ever seen each other during those few embarrassing moments in the hotel's ballroom, Jack's look confirmed that he remembered everything. Grinning, Jack strode in Carol's direction. Leaning forward, hand outstretched, he said, "Bobby Kennedy's the name." Carol didn't know whether to burst out laughing or drop dead on the airport floor. "I'm sorry," Carol said miserably, "for what happened that night." "You know," Jack smiled, "the big problem is that those 3 stories I told, they were true. I didn't even have to make them up. They just seemed to fit." Jack excused himself to greet the 20 or so folks who'd gathered to see him. "I'm Jack Kennedy. I'd appreciate your interest in the upcoming election." And then, once the hobnobbing was complete, he turned back Carol's way. By then, Carol had taken a seat on a hard bench, resting for the flight ahead. It was a little past 10 o'clock, and after a long week, Carol was anxious to get home to his family. He wasn't the only one in need of a rest. Looking exhausted, Jack sank beside him, stretched out his legs, and said, "If I fall asleep, wake me up before my crew gets here." Carol promised the senator that he would. Jack, who'd become adept at catching a few winks wherever he could, was asleep within seconds. Reclined on the bench, it was as if all the pressures of his presidential campaign had suddenly faded. They sat there together for some time, completely uninterrupted, as Carol tried to trace the strange circumstances that had led him to this moment. First, a chance run-in at the Hotel Lorraine, and now a second run-in at the airport. Of all the ways the stars might have aligned, this seemed rather fortuitous. Carol was glad for the chance to brush shoulders with greatness, even if he'd paid a price with a bit of embarrassment along the way. The minutes passed in silence, until Carol spotted the plane taxiing toward the gate. Though he'd never woken a sitting senator before, he figured a bit of humor might do the job. Tapping the senator, Carol said, Bob, it's time to go." Jack woke with his humor intact. "Yes, Ted," Jack grinned sleepily. And then they were gone, both Bob and Ted moving their separate ways. So when trying to select which scenes to read, my wife suggested this one. And while I like it, I think it's very lighthearted and funny, I wasn't sure if it was revealing enough, But then she said, "Can you imagine if something like that happened today? If we bombed the name of the presidential candidate on live air in the public or something?" But the fact that Jack Kennedy could come back with such humor and such grace and let him off the hook, there's a wonderful humility in that really resonates for me. I've only met one president in my lifetime, and my flow was a little different. I was the student speaker at Knox College in Galesburg, Illinois in 2007. Our commencement speaker was former President Bill Clinton. So I got to meet him right before. I'm a nervous wreck, and I'm shaking his hand, and I said, "Gosh, how am I supposed to follow you? He's a pretty well-known speaker, orator. Everyone knows Bill Clinton, And he looks at me, and he got very worried, and he goes, "I don't really know, kid." It never occurred to him someone has to follow him in the lineup, but anyway, I survived. We all got through it. So I'll close now with one very short scene, also featuring Ivan Nestingen, but also Jack Kennedy's youngest brother, Ted Kennedy, who on Valentine's Day 1960 went out on a limb and a ski jump to help his brother any way he could. Standing at the top of Tomahawk Ridge in Middleton, Wisconsin, 28-year-old Ted Kennedy took a deep breath, then fit his borrowed skis into the icy tracks of the ski jump. This was the Black Hawk Ski Club's annual ski jump competition. an event that was expected to draw nearly 10,000 spectators, or rather 10,000 potential voters from Wisconsin's 2nd District. Ted was accompanied by Madison Mayor Ivan Nestingen, who helped Ted work the crowd. If Ted had wondered what kind of people fling themselves from steep wood-framed ramps to determine who could fly the farthest through the frigid air, the answer was now clear: Wisconsinites. This was a far cry from what Ted had meant when he told his handler that he liked to ski. He meant slopes, not jumps. But that shouldn't have mattered. They were supposed to be here working the event, not competing in it. Earlier that morning, after picking up Ted from the airport, Ivan had suggested that Ted change into some ski clothes, complete with a pair of jumping skis borrowed from one of Ivan's friends. Not because Ted had to ski, Ivan had assured him, but simply so he'd look the part for the crowd. Ted was happy to do it. What better way to win over votes than to prove he was one of them? After suiting up and arriving at the jump, he even took a leisurely run down the hill. Why don't you go over to the practice jump? Take a look around, Ivan suggested. But don't go off unless you want to. Unless he wanted to, Ted didn't mind a downhill run on soft snow, but the odds of him voluntarily launching himself 190 feet through the air were slim. Still, he agreed to have a look. But as soon as Ted and 4 fellow skiers had marched to the top of the jump, ostensibly to have a look, the Marine Band down below suddenly began to play the Star-Spangled Banner, a signal that the competition was about to begin. Ted turned back toward the steps from which he'd come, checking to see how easy it might be to slip back down undetected. Unfortunately, his plans were interrupted by the announcer's voice booming over the loudspeaker. At the top of the jump, Edward Kennedy, the brother of Senator John F. Kennedy. Edward's never jumped before, but maybe if we all give him a big hand, he'll give it a try. Somewhere far below, Ted figured, Ivan was probably having the laugh of his life. Later, Ted would find the humor in it too, but not then. Ted inched forward on his skis, craning his neck to get a better look at the slick tracks just ahead of him. With his very pregnant wife, Joan, at home, now wasn't the best time to risk breaking his neck. Of course, he'd do almost anything for Jack, and he'd already proven himself an asset to his brother's political life by managing Jack's successful 1958 bid for Senate. But organizing and canvassing was one thing. Flinging himself down an icy ramp was another. "Here he comes, ladies and gentlemen," the announcer announced. "What a true sport he is. I am sure the senator would be proud." Far below, the Marine Band began a drum roll as the crowd shouted and whistled its enthusiasm. Now or never, Ted thought. And if not now, Ted knew there would be hell to pay. It was either jump, Ted recounted later, or if my father found out, I'd have to go back to Hyannisport and lick stamps for the rest of the campaign. He glanced toward Ivan, who offered little help. The only way down was down. Gritting his teeth, Ted peered past the crowd and the cars and pointed his ski tips down the track, then let gravity do the rest. He tried to slow down, but with every passing foot, he picked up speed. Then it happened. Sailing through the air, it was over in seconds. Ted collapsed into a thick pile of snow, dusted himself off, and slowly stood. The crowd roared in appreciation. It had all happened so fast. 1 minute he was safe at the top of the jump, the next he was airborne. And now he was regaining his bearings on solid ground and, adrenaline pumping, walked over to the broadcast booth. The announcer handed Ted the mic. He could have come up with a few choice words for Ivan, who'd gotten him into this mess, but he chose instead to use the platform wisely. "Did anybody see Hubert Humphrey at the top of that jump?" he shouted. "Then support my brother John." So, I love that scene too. In what universe, right? Can you imagine this is the campaign style stuff we had going? I mean, Bobby Kennedy was always like judging 4-H fairs all over the state. Like no one knew what they were doing, but they were doing everything they could. So, heard a lot of Kennedy stories tonight, but what do I leave you with? Maybe this. In a time when democracy's future seems increasingly fragile, I hope that every reader can take a lesson derived directly from Kennedy's Wisconsin team. You needn't be the richest, or the most well-known, or the most connected to enact real and lasting change. As cultural anthropologist Margaret Mead once said, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. It's the only thing that ever has." Or take it from the president's brother, Robert F. Kennedy, who in 1966 remarked, "Each time a man stands up for an ideal, or acts to improve the lot of others, or strikes out against injustice, he sends forth a tiny ripple of hope. And crossing each other from a million different centers of energy, and daring those ripples to build a current which can sweep down the mightiest walls of oppression and resistance. Kennedy taught us that one person can make a difference, and that every person has an obligation to try. A man may die, nations may rise and fall, but an idea lives on, Kennedy said. Ideas do. And perhaps America's greatest idea is that in good times and bad, we are stronger together. We just have to remember what together looks like. Thank you very much. All right. Okay. So we've got lots of time, and I've got some Q&A, and I have one little section I might read at the very end from the new Kennedy project. It's Bobby Kennedy, so if you have a few minutes at the end, I'd love to share 2 pages of that. But for now, I'd love to hear any questions you have or thoughts or stories, and then I'll share my Mexico story as well, I promise. Yes, can't forget that one. But yeah, please, this is my favorite part. What do you got?
Somebody raise your hand.
Stories, questions, I'll take anything. All right.
Hi.
Hi.
I was looking through one of those totes that some of us know about, all of the things that we need to get rid of. But I was looking through one where I found my high school theme paper, the first one in 1960 about Jack Kennedy and the Catholic Church.
Yes.
And the influence of the Catholic Church. It was my first one with footnotes.
Whoa.
Whoa.
Well done.
And not my last, but I'm there again, as the bug has bitten me. And if you know our last, you probably have seen
I saw those buttons.
our last
Yep.
buttons, but when they said do something, we said we need to do something, and we are trying. We all have to work very hard, and that's all.
I appreciate that. Well, thank you
And
for
I
that.
appreciate all of the people who are doing that.
Well, thank you. And I'll just share briefly. I mean, I've been really fortunate to go to a lot of, 10,000 or less towns across the state, and I hear that same comment at every single place I go to. And sometimes people get very specific on what that is, but it's just so cool. So there's a coalition of people in every small town in Wisconsin I've gone to who's doing something, and trying to make their state a little better and their country a little better, and that's really inspiring. So thank you for that work. Yes. Hey, Denner.
As we talked at lunch, my uncle was the Democratic campaign chairman of Opeka County for Jack Kennedy.
Yeah.
And he picked up Senator Kennedy at the airport in Appleton to drive him to a speech at a dairy farm in Clintonville. And
What?
And I had dinner with Senator Kennedy when I was 10 at my uncle's house. So, and I have a picture in here of him and my grandma's tavern in Manawa. But
What?
the point being is Senator Kennedy is studying the dairy industry in Wisconsin. And he turns to my uncle and says, "What's the difference between a heifer and a cow?" Okay. And by the time he got there, he knew the difference. And my uncle was a hard dude. He ended up running John Reynolds' governorship.
Yes. This was your
Guy.
uncle who drove him to Clintonville?
Yes. So he said, "You watch this guy in a Republican area."
Yeah.
And he had everybody in the palm of his hand. And as you talked about in that book, I heard this on public radio. I read the book a year ago, okay? But he probably won that election, the primary,
Yep.
because of the crossover of the Republican farmers at places like that voted for him over their loving Hubert Humphrey.
Wow. I cannot, there's a whole chapter in this book, and you see it was the cover of Life magazine, Clintonville, right here, outside a farm, with Hubert Humphrey and Jack Kennedy. There's a whole chapter dedicated to this because I kind of envisioning Humphrey being very frustrated because, Jack always looks dapper and wonderful and gets the cover of every magazine, and the only time he can get on a cover is if Jack Kennedy's beside him, But the fact that your uncle drove him to this moment, I would have loved to do that interview, It's just incredible. Thank you for sharing that.
When you talk about the difference, nobody was on the plane with Senator Kennedy. There were no reporters. There was no, he got off the plane by himself, and it's not that way now.
Not that way now. No, it's not. No, it's not. Thank you. Yes, we have some back here.
This brings back a lot of memories. I was 14 years old when he was running, and I was at a Catholic high school, all-girls high school, and two of us got together, and we went downtown and worked for Kennedy, and we colored the maps with colored pencils. And several times, I met Kennedy twice, once at the high school that I eventually taught at. And we got, the security then was very different. The two of us were right up next to Kennedy, and my friend was savvy enough to have a notebook and have him sign it, flip it, sign it, flip it. And finally, I had one signature, which I sold once when I was hard up. And finally, the security people said, "These two have been here long enough, get them out of here." But we ended up sitting on the hood of his car. And then later on, we went, my mother, who could not stand him, and was very bothered by the fact that I was working for him. Well, teenagers could get around in Milwaukee by themselves in those days, but she did take me and my 2-year-old brother to meet him at Wauwatosa Library.
Wow.
And when we went up to talk to him, he looked at, my brother was 2 years old, he said, "Oh, you remind me of my daughter."
Oh, gosh. Thank you for that. I love those stories so much. And everywhere I go, everyone's got a story like that. It's so it was so personalized. It seemed that way, you know. Oh, any other thoughts or questions? Yeah.
Yes, I talked to John Kennedy the night he was elected. I was a young man in Alaska, 13 years old. Late November or early November, cold, snowy. I was delivering my papers, so I stopped at my friend's house, whose father happened to be the Speaker of the Alaska Assembly. And lo and behold, John Kennedy calls. And so my friend's father's talking to him, and he says, "I have a young man here that would like to talk to you." So he tries to hand the phone to his son, Mark, and Mark says, "No." So I grab it, and I go, "Hello." And so we talked, and finally he says, "You know, Johnny, I got a job to do. I got to go." So fast forward to 1968. I was going to school at the University of Southern California. Bobby Kennedy was speaking at Bogart Auditorium.
Yeah.
And I was late for class, and I knew how to get out the back door, so I go running out the back door just as Bobby Kennedy came.
Oh, my gosh.
We crashed into each other, and two Secret Service guys had me up against the wall. And Bobby said, "You go to school here?" And I said, "Yes, and I'm late for class." And he said, "Would you like a note?" And I said, "Well, I don't think that's going to work." So he says, and Robert Wagner, the actor, was there, Secret Service. He says, "Would you like to walk to my car with me?"
Oh, my God.
So for whatever period of time that was, my feet didn't touch the ground. And he was the most unbelievable. I'd never met Jack, but then I told him the story about that. And it was a magical moment.
Oh.
And that was like in May, and not on my flight home to Alaska. I stopped in Seattle to see my sister, and the paper was on the floor that said that Bobby Kennedy. And one of my fraternity brothers said, "Do you want to go to the Ambassador Hotel and see Bobby Kennedy?" Back then, if you were flying student standby, you had to fly at 2 in the morning, or you wouldn't get a flight. So I said, "No, I've got to get back to Alaska." So I took the flight, and the Kennedys in person are everything they are in pictures. They're immaculate, they're kind, they have the Kennedy accent, and they're incredible cordial.
Yeah.
I mean, he could have just blown me off.
Yeah.
You know, and there we were with two Secret Service guys, Robert Wagner and Johnny Bruce, walking to his limousine. So it was a good time.
Oh my! I feel like I got to write a sequel. If y'all would just repeat these stories to me, I'll take some notes. I love that so much, and the book I'm working on now, I mentioned, it's called Becoming Bobby Kennedy: The Transformative Life of an American Icon. So I'm just so enamored with the idea of what happened to him between pre-assassination and post-assassination of Jack, and then the final 5 years of his life.
Anyway,
Thank
I
you.
enjoyed this so much.
Oh, thank you for that story. I'm going to remember that forever. Thank you. Goodness. Yes.
There's another connection to the Kennedys because his sister was at St.
course.
Coletta's,
Yeah.
and she was there for many, many years. And when I was at Whitewater, I heard stories about that and how wonderful that whole family was to everybody there, the staff. And then what's her name was head of Special Olympics. Ethel.
Ethel, yeah, of course.
Yeah, Ethel, yeah. And I met her I worked with Special Olympics, and it was the track meet where the state was in Stevens Point.
Yeah.
So she was there at least once, maybe twice, walking through the crowds, and no matter how hot or how cold, she was there, right in the middle of it. She wasn't making speeches.
Right.
She was just there supporting everybody, and so that whole family was really something.
Well,
And yeah.
I asked everyone, is there any verifiable evidence that during his many swings through Wisconsin, Jack ever stopped to visit her? And there's one writer who claims that he stopped one time, but I couldn't find it anywhere on the record.
Yeah.
Certainly later in life, other Kennedys visit her often. They built a little pool for her. The nurses speak very highly of them,
Yeah.
gave tons of money and all that. And I've been there myself, but there's no verifiable fact that he ever popped by.
Oh, that's interesting.
One rumor. That's all I know.
And one other quick
Yeah.
thing, that when I was the first time, fourth grade, the first time I actually got involved, even ask anything about the election, I asked my mom, and I'll never forget this. I asked my mom, I said, why don't they like him? Well, why don't they like him? Because he's Catholic. What's the deal with that? And she said, in all sincerity, she said that, well, people are afraid that the Pope is going to take over the country. And I was like, what? He's really far away. How can he be taking over the country? But did you?
That was a real problem for him. I mean, of the many things that were holding him back, the religion, I mean, the last time a Catholic person tried to run for president was 1928, Al Smith.
Yeah.
That did not go well at all. And so there's a story in here where Pat Lucey, our former governor, talked about campaigning for Al Smith and just realizing Catholics never have a chance at this, And so there's a scene in the book where Pat Lucey meets JFK for the first time at a convention, and they do not hit it off. They do not like each other. And they're both Catholics. They're both very progressive, but they had very different ideas. But then moving forward, they became really close allies. And so that gets a bit beyond your question. But no, the only reason he was able to finally, I think, pull that off, there was a moment right before the election, maybe September, October in Houston. You probably heard this story where he's at this convention with all these Houston pastors and reverends, and he finally finds the right line. He couldn't find it throughout the primary. He tried everything to try to get this monkey off his back, but he finally had to say something to the effect of, if so-and-so millions of Americans suddenly couldn't become president because they're Catholic, what's it say about America? If you're immediately unable to run for president because of who you worship. And that was the one line that kind of resonated with enough people to kind of finally overlook that.
But have you heard anything in all your studies that people actually believed that the Pope was going to
Yes.
take over? Is he just telling me?
Yep.
Yeah.
Lots of people thought that. Yep. There was that. There was contraception. There were a few things that
Yeah.
really worried people, and that was one of them.
The Pope was going to take over
Oh, yeah.
the country.
That was the word on the street. Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah, the Chicago Pope, he can have it. Yeah. Come on in. Yeah, that's right. Any other thoughts? This is the easiest
wife
Q&A
says-
ever. I love it. Yes.
My wife says, talk about the Vietnam War.
Oh,
So I will.
okay.
I was waiting along with another Eugene McCarthy backer in front of Bobby Kennedy's hotel headquarters when in Omaha, Nebraska, when Bobby Kennedy pulled up. And what I just want to say is how delightful he was. I asked him about the war and why he and his brothers supported it. Let him know I was against it.
Yep.
And he was just delightful and friendly, whereas I rode the elevator with my guy McCarthy, and he was totally boring and just would say nothing.
Well, thank you for that. I have been researching a lot about those two, and it's great to hear that firsthand account.
Didn't Jackie have a lot to do with this campaign as well?
For sure. Yes.
She stayed right aside even though he was
Yeah.
blitzing ditzing.
He sure was. I mean, it was funny because in some ways she was a great asset, but in other ways she was kind of a liability. She has a famous line where she said, "The only people I liked in Wisconsin were people who worked directly for Jack. Everyone else looked at me like they were barnyard animals." So she didn't exactly make the best impression at all times, but certainly there's a story that that their son was conceived in Prairie du Chien or nearby, so people love that story. Timeline checks out. In fact, Ron Kine told me that story. But certainly, I think Jack Kennedy has a lot of lines where he's on one side of the street, Jack is on the other, and everyone's flocking to shake her hand, and no one's shaking his hand. He got very mad. But truthfully, I've been to a lot of towns. Gosh, what was the one I was just in? Oh, I can't bring it up, but there was a place where Jackie was, and I guess that she refused to shake hands. She just kind of nice, polite wave. She didn't want to get too close to anyone. So yeah, certainly she was a bit of the upper crust type, but certainly she found ways to, again, when needed, get over the supermarket loudspeaker and sincerely say, here's why you should vote for Jack. And certainly she put up with all kinds of things. So, and all kinds of grief. I mean, the children she lost in birth and stillbirth and all of that. I mean, it was a tragic time for both of them at the end. But absolutely, asset and a liability in some ways, I think. But any final thoughts?
I've got a story that's tangentially related.
Yeah, let's hear it.
I was, I think, in 3rd grade when Kennedy was shot. And so that was kind of my first kind of awareness of politics and the president and whatever. And I remember a classmate of mine who was probably the smartest kid in the class. I don't know if he had a button or if he was just saying it, but when Goldwater was running, he always liked to say Barry, B-U-R-Y. Barry Goldwater. And that was my first, it's a pun, and you're in 3rd grade, and it just was kind of an awakening.
That's funny. What would you like? One more, and then we'll tell the Mexico story. Yeah, I see a hand back here, or in the very back. Pat, yeah.
I told you the story.
Yes, let's hear it.
Came in. My folks, I lived in a Catholic neighborhood in Chicago, Mayor Daley's neighborhood. They thought the Kennedys walked on water, to the fact that my mother named their dog Bouvier.
Says it all.
And I have a Kennedy button at home still. That's a treasure.
Well, that's a great segue because I happen to bring a Kennedy button myself. This is my 40th birthday present. So there's a little official Kennedy campaign pen, and of course I've got the Eau Claire leader telegrams, Kennedy assassinated. But this is the special one. This was a reader who went to Eau Claire back in the early 60s when Kennedy was on campus, and this guy was giving a tour, and then Jack Kennedy, or one of his aides, gave him this pin. If you know much about the Kennedys, both first Jack and later Bobby would give these PT-109 pins out. And so this man who's in his 80s now, he sent it to me in the mail after reading the book, and so it's an actual PT-109 pin. This, of course, being the ship that JFK was on when it was hit by the torpedo, and so I just treasure this thing. Knowing it was in his hand, handed over, and now handed to me, it just gives me chills every time. So that concludes show and tell, but I do have a Mexico story for you, so I can get it right. This is so funny. Paul Lucy stole the show this night, let me tell you, but he was talking about how his dad, of course, was ambassador to Mexico for a bit in between the governorships and stuff, but as the story goes, President Kennedy was in Mexico, I think it's 1962, and he and the Mexican president, they're in an open-air car together, they're waving to the crowd in Mexico. And in Mexican culture, I guess, the idea is if you say you admire something, often the person will then just give it to you as a gift. And so Kennedy doesn't know this, and they're waving, he sees the glint of the Mexican president's watch, and he just casually says, I admire that watch so much, it's just beautiful. And the Mexican president's like, well, I guess I got to give it to him. So he takes off this watch, and he gives it to President Kennedy, and Kennedy's like, wow, thank you, that's very kind of you. Cut to that night, they're having a very gorgeous state dinner, and here comes Jackie Kennedy walking down the stairs. And the Mexican president says, I just admire your wife so much. And Jack Kennedy said, here's your watch back. So if we have 2 more minutes, would you like to hear the debut of this Bobby Kennedy book? It's just a page and a half, and then I'll get out of your hair. So again, the premise of this book is, I love that, it's so good, it's so good. Can't confirm it on the record, but we're just going to pretend it's true. So the book, again, it's really my fascination. I mean, I was very engaged with the Jack Kennedy book. I think that was a lot of fun for me. I did it during COVID. I couldn't really travel anywhere, so I found this kind of secret file buried in the bowels of the internet, the JFK online repository, and it just said Wisconsin. And I was like, that's interesting to me. You click, and you click a little deeper, and there were all these transcripts from folks, and those transcripts kind of made up the bulk of the research for this book. So that's how that one got going. But then, of course, you're doing this, and you kind of tangentially learn about the other brothers. And so Bobby Kennedy fascinated me for the reasons you shared, just kind of a very seemingly warm, comedic guy, but also a real dark side. He was called Brooding Bobby and Black Bobby as a child, just a very brooding guy. Very spoiled, I think, as a child. People did not particularly like him. He was not popular. Jack Kennedy wanted nothing to do with his younger brother. He was running for the Congress in the beginning, just kind of sent him off to the movies instead of having him help because he thought he was a liability. But something changed in him, right? And so certainly when it came to presidential campaigning and also Senate campaigning, Bobby figured it out. And he hated the glad headed. He hated doing that, but he knew how to like get the people in line to do the thing. And so after his brother's death, I mean, here's this guy who's suddenly adrift. He never wanted to be the candidate. He always wanted to be the guy behind the candidate. So the whole book is about how he changed in those final 5 years, how he went from like kind of the spoiled rich kid to the guy who literally gave his last ounce of breath trying to help underrepresented people. And he famously traveled to eastern Kentucky and held these hearings to try to get people to find ways to give them enough food to live. And he famously went to the Mississippi Delta and watched children with distended stomachs. And he famously went to indigenous tribes and Native American reservations, including Pine Ridge, and these shocking stories. Cesar Chavez kind of helped end the fast. Went to the Amazon rainforest. Can you imagine like a presidential candidate swimming in the Amazon rainforest in the Nile, or not the Nile, in the Amazon River? And there's a funny joke. He said he had a friend who was swimming, and he kind of put on his Walter Cronkite voice, and he goes, "We never quite knew when he decided to run for president, but some say it was when he was floating down the Amazon River with piranhas." And he sure enough was in the Amazon with piranhas when he made that joke right before he announced. And so this guy is a fascinating guy. One time his brother Jack, he found this old directive, a military directive, that the Marines should be able to walk 50 miles in a day. And Jack Kennedy jokingly said, "Hey, Bobby, why don't you make it happen?" And Bobby goes, "Okay." Kept his dress shoes on, his hush puppies, and went out the door. Walked 50 miles in 19 hours. His poor aides, who were also in the Justice Department trying to keep up, no one could make it, right? But he made it. But the night I'll read about it, I think perhaps the most impressive physical display of all from Bobby, which was when he climbed Mount Kennedy. Have you heard this story before? It's unbelievable. 14,000-foot unclimbed mountain named after his dead brother. No one goes there. No one had ever climbed it again. He had to first fly into from one JFK airport to another JFK airport to then get to Mount Kennedy. Can you imagine going from two airports named after your dead brother to then climb the mountain also named after your dead brother? Like, could you imagine that? So this scene picks up where he and his climbing partner, a guy named Jim Whittaker, the first American to ever climb Everest, he was going to help him get up this mountain come heck or high water. Jim Whittaker is still alive. Last year for my birthday, I got an autographed copy of his book, and it says, "To the man who climbed with Bobby." And it was just a real, probably my most powerful keepsake from this story. So here's the scene, March 22nd, I think it's 65, 65, when he's climbing, 64, when he's climbing Mount Kennedy, named after his brother, so he can say he was the first human to ever summit Mount Kennedy. On Monday, March 22nd, Jim Whittaker and Bobby began their 1,100-mile journey from Seattle to Mount Kennedy, flying into Juneau and then Whitehorse. This was the final stop before reaching their ultimate destination, Mount Kennedy's base camp. After a weather-related setback, the Canadian government sent a helicopter to transport them the remaining 135 miles to base camp later that afternoon. Upon their approach, the wonder-struck Royal Canadian Air Force pilot remarked, "It looks like the end of the world." Jim Whittaker likely agreed, watching as the trees gave way to the barren landscape. As for Bobby, he didn't even seem to notice one way or the other. Rather than gaze at the mountain ahead of him, he focused on the Winston Churchill book on his lap. If Bobby was searching for some last-minute advice from Churchill, perhaps he found it. "If you're going through hell," Churchill once said, "keep going." Throughout their journey from Juneau to base camp, Bobby and Jim had ample time to get to know one another. I found him somewhat shy but warm and personable and intensely curious about everything. Me, our team, the mountain climbing in general, Jim recalled. While Bobby appeared thrilled to complete the climb, Jim remembered that he seemed less enthusiastic about the climb itself, likely due to Bobby's intense fear of heights. Shortly after their initial meeting on the plane, Jim asked Bobby what physical regimen he'd been doing to prepare himself for the climb. "I've been running up and down the stairs at home," Bobby quipped, "and I practiced hollering, 'help.'" Bobby opened his eyes and peered out the tent flap, taking in the untouched uphill landscape ahead. The snow glimmered in the early morning cold, though soon temperatures would rise to a comfortable 25 degrees. Bobby, who again was more accustomed to Hyannisport and Palm Springs, nevertheless made the most of his new surroundings. Ostensibly, he was there for one purpose, to get up and come down alive. However, ascending Mount Kennedy was more than a physical feat. It was an emotional journey. Bobby would attempt to ascend the Yukon's highest peak for the same reason Orpheus descended to the underworld, to try to bring back the dead or at least feel the force of a final goodbye. Shortly after breakfast, Jim fitted Bobby with a pair of snowshoes and began teaching him the technique for climbing. Bobby learned quickly, lifting his knees high enough to climb above the powdery snow. At 10 a.m., when Jim believed Bobby was ready, the senator from New York strapped himself into his 45-pound pack, into which he'd crammed clothes, sunscreen, candy bars, beef jerky, and likely a Winston Churchill book. Then the team set out. Jim took the lead, followed by Bobby, each secured together and separated by 60 feet of nylon rope. The idea was that if one climber fell through a crevasse, the other would arrest the fall. While Jim had gained notoriety for his ascent of Everest, his experience as a guide was what made him most valuable to Bobby. Over several years, he had successfully led climbers up Washington's Mount Rainier more than 50 times. As such, he knew how to manage amateur climbers like Bobby, many of whom struggled to pace themselves properly. Yet not Bobby, who maintained a good pace and trailed closely behind Jim for much of the morning. Too close, in fact. At one point, Jim had to stop to explain to Bobby that the slack line was the only way he would make sure they didn't fall. Whitaker explained that if they were to plunge into a crevasse, then Bobby would fall in alongside him, rather than break his fall. Okay, Jim, Bobby reluctantly agreed, but could you pick up the pace a little? Thank you all so much. We have books for sale for $20. I appreciate you being here.